It's much appreciated. It's really an honor for me to be here at the University of Iowa and to be with all of you. But let me start by clarifying why I'm here. No matter what they say, I'm not here because you have the biggest bar in the Big Ten, although I did manage to find the Union Bar this afternoon. I'm not here because you have the finest creative writing program in the country. I'm pretty sure I couldn't even get in. I'm not here to spend a lot of time and money at the Prairie Lights bookstore, though that didn't stop me. There are many good reasons to come to the coolest college town in the Midwest, but I'm here because the University of Iowa chapter of one, started just this year, is already one of the best and most active in the country. My visit is the rather dubious reward for having a World AIDS Day campaign that was better than 110 other schools in America. And I'll note that Iowa State didn't even compete this year. Will you join me before I get started in giving Stephen and the IU1 chapter a round of applause? It takes a certain kind of student, a certain kind of idealist, to compete in this campus challenge. You hand-wrote letters to your members of Congress. You hosted public awareness events. You put on an important conference. And you are rewarded with a lecture on a venereal disease. You could get that with significantly less effort at the Student Health Services. At Health Services, by the way, it is actually Chlamydia and Gonorrhea Month. I can only imagine how those festivities are shaping up. I'd also point out that the One campaign is associated with a variety of celebrity activists, from Bono to George Clooney to Matt Damon. So here's one thought. The next time there is a One national challenge offering a reward, I'd advise that you hold out for Angelina Jolie. But you'll have to make do tonight with me. Tonight my topic is not just a disease, not just a terrible challenge. It is a decade-long response that has shown the best of science, the best of citizen activism, the best of Africa, and the best of America. And all of this has brought us to an extraordinary moment in the history of public health when we can see the beginning of the end of AIDS. But before I get started, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. Speechwriters are supposed to be anonymous, and at this task I've succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. I graduated from a school very different from this one, from Wheaton College, just outside Chicago. As some of you may know, it's a religiously conservative place. When I was there, the joke on campus was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. I spent some time as a staffer on Capitol Hill. Then I went into the media. In the spring of 1999, I was a senior editor at U.S. News and World Report covering politics. And I got a call from then Governor George W. Bush of Texas, who wanted to meet me at the JW Marriott Hotel in Washington, D.C. First thing he said to me was, "This isn't an interview. I've read your stuff. I want you to write my announcement speech, my convention speech, and my inaugural address. And I want you to move to Austin immediately." At that point, he wasn't even a declared candidate. But his confidence was infectious, and I loaded up my family in the car and went. From the start, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He is outgoing, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. He has a penchant for locker room humor that makes me uncomfortable. I remember after one policy session at the governor's mansion in Austin, when everyone had gone but me, the governor had some time before his next appointment. He asked me, "Do you want to hang out a little while?" With a rudeness that now seems crazed, I replied, "Not really," which is not the way to treat a future president. But I came to respect Bush as a politician and a person. He's casual and funny and authentic and kind and loyal to the people around him. And he can occasionally be sharp-tongued. Every year on the day of the State of the Union, the president sits down with all the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, the late Peter Jennings asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." The pace of those years, including 9/11 and war and counterinsurgency and Katrina, was at times exhausting. Does it cost your health? In December of 2004, while working on the president's second inaugural address, I had a heart attack. The president's doctor had me checked into the hospital under an assumed name to hide from all the press calls. Adding insult to incapacity, there wasn't a single call. And it has a cost to your family. During the heat of the 2004 presidential election, my little boy Nicholas, who was then 6 years old, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." My 9-year-old, who was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" I told him, "I think I can get a job. I might go to a think tank." And he said, "Of course, what's a think tank?" And so I told him, "Well, it's people who read and speak and have meetings and things." And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" After the 2004 election, my job at the White House changed. I became a policy advisor focused on global health, development, genocide, areas where my interests had been leading me for many years. And I saw something very hopeful. In one of the bitterest times of partisanship in modern history, I also found a number of issues where members of both parties and people of every ideology have come together. As part of my job at the White House, I worked with conservative and liberal groups to fight global AIDS and to confront malaria and to oppose global sex trafficking and to confront the crisis in Darfur. And I've seen some odd alliances grow. I've gotten to know Bono of the rock band U2 a bit over the years. Several years ago, he invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, living under the tyranny of 2 deadlines a week. I actually filed the column at 6 a.m. this morning. I often fill in for my friend David Brooks on the PBS NewsHour when he's out of town. If David is off, there is a PBS union rule that requires the presence of a nerdy moderate on the program. That's me. But I've also remained involved in issues of health and development. I'm a fellow at ONE, a bipartisan group dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable disease. ONE demonstrates that it is a bipartisan group by including a range of people from Mike Huckabee all the way to John Podesta. These issues are truly an exception, a safe haven from the polarization and bitterness of American politics. I worked on hundreds of speeches at the White House, and to be honest, I remember very few of them. But I remember one in particular, now 10 years ago. In the 2003 State of the Union address, President Bush said these words: "Tonight I propose the emergency plan for AIDS relief, a work of mercy beyond all current international efforts to help the people of Africa. This comprehensive plan will prevent 7 million new AIDS infections, treat at least 2 million people with life-extending drugs, and provide humane care for millions of people suffering from AIDS and for children orphaned by AIDS." End quote. In retrospect, the words themselves were not particularly memorable, but the moment was remarkable. An initiative of this scale and ambition, the largest effort to fight a single disease in human history, was utterly unexpected. Bush's strongest political supporters had not demanded it. His strongest critics, at least for a time, remained suspicious. PEPFAR existed entirely because of a willing leader, a creative policy team, the pressure of advocates and activists, and a vast need. I remember my first visits to sub-Saharan Africa as a White House staffer soon after the announcement. Of about 30 million people with HIV, perhaps 50,000 were receiving treatment. The pandemic had already produced 14 million orphans. Child-headed households were common. Child-headed villages were not unknown. Walking through South African shanty towns, you mainly met grandparents and their grandchildren. The intervening generation had been nearly erased. Millions were dying at the same time, and yet in total isolation, surrounded by the barbed wire of stigma. In the worst affected countries, life expectancy had fallen by 20 years. I recall speaking with an American physician in Zambia who had begun doing small-scale treatment in the year 2000. When he moved to Lusaka, his daughter attended an English language school across town. Each school day, he would have to leave about an hour early to navigate large traffic jams caused by constant funeral processions that went on all day, every day. No society can long survive in the shadow of death. PEPFAR gathered the support of an odd and hopeful coalition. Its congressional sponsors included Representative Henry Hyde of Illinois, a pro-life leader, and Representative Barbara Lee of California, Senate Republican leader Bill Frist, and also Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. Religious conservatives joined with traditionally liberal health organizations to push for the measure. It was signed into law 4 months after it was announced. Implementation was swift under the theory that PEPFAR's first administrator, Ambassador Randy Tobias, which he described as ready, fire, aim. By late 2005, with the help of PEPFAR and the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, there were about 800,000 people on treatment. That number today is more than 5 million in sub-Saharan Africa. An estimated 600,000 mother-to-child infections have been prevented. These are some of the fastest, broadest achievements in the history of public health, and they require some explanation. Inaction in global health requires no explanation. National selfishness is a natural state. Generosity must have a reason. And this reason was a remarkable confluence of events, ideas, and individuals. First, America's domestic fight against AIDS set the stage for this progress. Some expected and predicted that the AIDS crisis in the gay community would increase anger and stigma in America. Instead, it created a community of effective advocates in America and Europe. It showed eventual success in prevention efforts, and it got policymakers and faith communities more accustomed to dealing with the issue. In my case, I was introduced to the crisis when my college roommate died of AIDS in the 1990s. He was the class president, he knew the name of everyone on campus, and I watched his life fade painfully away. It was only a few years before the development of miracle drugs that could have saved his life. But he died in 1994 at the age of 30. Many in my generation had this type of experience, an experience that those of you who are in college now will never have. Second, many started seeing firsthand the scale of the African AIDS crisis. Bono played a key role in raising consciousness. Cabinet members, members of Congress, congressional staff came back from African trips with the moral certainty that something had to be done. Third, America was experiencing a period of technological advance. Miracle combination drugs were becoming less and less costly. Initially, ARV treatments cost about $15,000 a year in the West. By the time of the 2003 State of the Union address, the cost was about $300 a year for generics. But the biggest source of momentum for treatment came from within the government. And it involved a fundamental shift in development theory, change in vision, which came to be known as the Monterey Consensus. The government was willing to dramatically increase foreign assistance to nations willing to work as responsible partners, dedicated to reform and transparency. The model was partnership, not paternalism, and it involved trusting local people, including Africans. History is pushed by large economic and technological trends, but its shape is ultimately determined by a leader in a meeting, in a room with coffee around a coffee table. In the Oval Office meeting where PEPFAR was debated, there was an extensive discussion about treatment. Could the money be better spent on other, more cost-efficient goals? At one point, National Security Advisor Condi Rice spoke up and talked about her mother, who was diagnosed with cancer when Condi was a teenager, but lived on cancer treatment until Condi was 30 years old. She said in that meeting, "You bet those years meant something to me, and they would mean something to every African child whose mother lives to take care of them." Ultimately, President Bush and congressional leaders of both parties believed that Africans were capable of large-scale treatment with large-scale outside help, and that treatment was essential to the stability of whole societies. They bet $15 billion on this belief, and it has been generally justified. A decade into this noble experiment, some lessons have emerged. I'm not a development expert. I'm a former government official who was forced to deal with issues beyond his competence, but I'll venture a few conclusions. We learned that measured outcome goals matter. They focus effort and encourage accountability. The best African leaders understand that expectations are a form of respect and help them transform their own nations. We learned that scale matters, that boldness matters. A smattering of pilot projects changes little. They tend to be run from the outside. PEPFAR took a different approach, national scale-ups and countrywide plans. This demands real development, the creation of supply systems and management systems, the kind of accountability and professionalism that can bleed through an entire health system and beyond. And we learned that effective aid requires the integration of efforts into a central command structure. This has been the role of the presidential initiative in public health policy. Before PEPFAR, some people working on the AIDS issue in a country from USAID didn't even know their counterparts from the Centers for Disease Control. PEPFAR acted as a kind of ad hoc foreign assistance reform, focusing resources, attention, and personnel. AIDS was the first great front in a global war on disease and extreme poverty, but it was not the last. Over the course of 2 administrations, one Republican, one Democrat, America has built and maintained a broad infrastructure of initiatives and programs to confront pressing international needs. We've always taken the lead, for example, in emergencies after tsunamis and earthquakes, often with the military playing a key role. Now we also have continuing efforts such as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which works with countries committed to reform and free markets and human rights on longer-term economic growth. And the President's Malaria Initiative, fighting an unnecessary disease that targets children under the age of 5 and undermines economic growth. President Obama has contributed Feed the Future, an important multi-country effort to increase agricultural production, the basis for economic growth in much of the world. In many ways, this is a golden age of American foreign assistance. These are efforts in the great tradition of the Marshall Plan and the Peace Corps. They have emerged with the support of both parties in Congress and a broad cross-section of the American public. And these efforts are being done in a new and different way: rigorous, outcome-oriented, transparent, and dramatically successful. I've seen the arrival of this new era of engagement, and now I'm seeing a variety of challenges that threaten it. The largest, of course, is the fiscal crisis. Our federal government is entering a period of prolonged budget pressure. Politics is increasingly focused on the distribution of unpleasant burdens. Sequestration is a case in point. Politicians employ across-the-board cuts because they don't want to make difficult choices. But cuts that are evenly applied are not evenly felt. There's a difference between cutting a highway program and cutting a malaria program, a measurable human difference. It is hard to determine how sequestration will be fully implemented at the program level, but the One campaign has made some conservative estimates. Perhaps 165,000 people will not get AIDS treatment they would have gotten otherwise. About 65,000 fewer HIV-positive women will get services to prevent mother-to-child transmission. 1.2 million fewer insecticide-treated mosquito nets will be distributed. More than 800,000 fewer vaccines will be distributed through the Gavi Alliance. 650,000 fewer families will be reached under Feed the Future. And this fiscal challenge is compounded by the ideological direction of some in the GOP. It is easy, very easy, for politicians to highlight the division between citizens and non-citizens and impose burdens on those who do not vote in U.S. elections. A few Republican politicians, such as Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, are conducting a crusade against aid, arguing that it should all be eliminated. So how should we respond to these arguments and pressures? The first response is simple. The fiscal argument against aid is a form of damaging misdirection. The cause of our long-term fiscal crisis is not just any kind of spending. It is a combination of entitlement commitments, an aging population, and rapid health cost inflation. Humanitarian assistance amounts to less than 1% of the federal budget, an expenditure irrelevant to America's long-term structural fiscal challenge. Put bluntly, no one can claim that the budget crisis exists because America spends too much money on bed nets and AIDS drugs. Politicians who claim courage for irrelevant cuts in foreign aid are subtracting from public seriousness on the deficit. They are targeting some of the most vulnerable people in the world for ideological rather than fiscal reasons and undermining bipartisan achievements that have saved millions of lives. Our second response to current challenges needs to be an intellectual argument. Great humanitarian goals are served by foreign assistance. American foreign policy would not be particularly American if a commitment to universal rights and dignity did not play a role. But this is not just an altruistic add-on in America's global role. It is a centerpiece commitment of American foreign policy, serving American interests around the world. Economic and security assistance are essential in strategic allies. In many parts of the world, America is in an intense competition for hearts and minds with Islamist groups. Extremists often support elaborate networks of social services to build support in communities where they have taken refuge. An aircraft carrier can't fight that influence, but a school or a clinic just may. In regions such as sub-Saharan Africa, America's image and standing have been dramatically improved by aid programs. Recent polling has shown that 8 of 10 countries with the highest opinion of America are in Africa. Some of those countries are more positive about America's role in the world than Americans are in polling. And some of the people who understand and value this most are in the military. Defense and development, of course, are very different, but they are linked. Both seek a world that is more secure, more prosperous, and more just. And when development can help avoid conflict and crisis, it can reduce the need for interventions of other kinds. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates puts it this way: development is a lot cheaper than sending in soldiers. A fascinating recent poll found that 84% of post-9/11 military officers believe that strengthening development and diplomacy is equally important to our national security as improving our military capabilities. Promoting development and fighting disease are sometimes called soft power. But soft power is real power in shaping security environments in a positive way. While the political consensus for foreign assistance is fragile in America, the intellectual consensus is broad and bipartisan. Conservative and liberal thinkers, realists and idealists generally understand that the worst of problems in the world, terrorism, drug trafficking, human trafficking, criminal gangs, refugee flows, pandemics, emerge from weak states, ungoverned regions, and hopeless parts of the planet. And by encouraging hope and progress and health and good government, we add to the security of America and to the peace of the world. A world of misery is a world of danger. A world of hope and progress tends toward peace and stability. These are the traditional arguments for aid, and they are important. But sometimes they tend to view Africa as a problem to be solved, and that view is far too narrow. My first visits to Africa came during a health crisis, a vast emergency affecting much of the continent. But in most places I travel today, it is extraordinary how much has changed. There's a palpable sense of promise and optimism. A few numbers help tell the story. Between 2010 and 2015, 7 of 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world are predicted to be in sub-Saharan Africa. Economic growth across the continent runs at an average of 5%. There are countries such as Mozambique that have grown at an average of 7.5% per year for the last 15 years. The manufacturing sector in Africa is expected to create between 8 million and 15 million new jobs by 2020. The African middle class has tripled in size during the last 30 years. Anyone who reads a newspaper is constantly running across stories like the recent one in the New York Times, detailing a new Microsoft plan to sell a low-cost Windows smartphone in Africa. According to the article, Africa is, quote, the world's fastest growing region for smartphones, and with an average sales growth of 43% since 2000. I've benefited from Steve Radlett's book, Emerging Africa, that profiles 17 countries that are leading the way on the continent. He credits their success to 5 factors: the rise of more democratic and accountable governments, the implementation of more sensible economic policies, the end of a decades-long debt crisis with its major changes in Africa's relationship with the international community, the spread of new technologies that are creating new opportunities for business and political accountability, the emergence of a new generation of policymakers, activists, and business leaders. All these trends are raising a great prospect for America to embrace the opportunities of Africa. In our economic circumstances, this is not an option, it's a necessity. Nearly 87% of the world's economic growth over the next 5 years is forecast to take place outside the United States. The poorest 2/3 of the world's population represent $5 trillion in purchasing power and a huge opportunity for exports. By 2020, Africa is predicted to have 128 million consumer households, up from 90 million households in 2011. By 2020, the top 18 cities in Africa are predicted to have a combined spending power of $1.3 trillion. The Chinese understand these facts and can be found everywhere in Africa. Everyone seems to view China as the economic future, but China views the developing world as the economic future, and we should as well. The challenges and opportunities of Africa are opening new frontiers of engagement, and sometimes the challenges and opportunities are flip sides of the same coin. Much of Africa has a serious infrastructure problem. Only 22.7% of roads in sub-Saharan Africa are paved. Transportation costs are high. But one economic analyst has pointed out that as African economies advance, infrastructure represents $1 trillion investment prospect. Africa suffers from energy poverty. About 70% of people do not have reliable access to electricity. They can't cook with modern fuels or engage in productive activities after sunset. This is a serious constraint on economic growth, but someone will provide the energy for Africa's future. Agricultural productivity in Africa has lagged behind much of the world over the last several decades, but a greener green revolution is now possible. More than 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. With proper investments, annual agricultural outputs could go from $280 billion a year to $880 billion by 2030. Natural resources in Africa are often a source of corruption and civil conflict, but with better governance and transparency, energy and mining revenues can benefit the public. Similar stories can be told on education, trade, and technology. The barriers are serious. The possibilities are endless. And for those of you interested in AIDS policy, this is also an extraordinary moment. The end of mother-to-child transmission is now a serious prospect. And over the last few years, the science of AIDS prevention has been transformed. Studies have shown dramatic results from male circumcision, a more than 60% reduction in the risk of transmission from women to men. New technologies, such as microbicides, have proved effective when used before exposure to the disease. Studies have found a 96% decrease in transmission to a heterosexual partner when AIDS treatment is begun early. Treating AIDS sooner rather than later is a dramatically effective form of AIDS prevention. Scientists have begun considering something previously unimaginable. What if these methods of AIDS prevention were combined, along with condom use and the prevention of mother-to-child transmission, and aggressively applied in the most affected regions and among the most vulnerable groups in Africa? Scientific models project that transmission rates, already declining in most places, would fall an additional 40% to 60%. This raises a prospect comparable to medical achievements such as the eradication of smallpox or advances in cancer treatment. Currently, for every new AIDS patient put on treatment, about 2 more become infected. Millions of lives are saved, but ground is still lost to the disease. With combination prevention, the balance would shift. For every person who begins treatment, there would be fewer than 1 who becomes infected. And this would be the beginning of the end of AIDS. We can see this prospect just ahead. And your engagement and activism can help make it happen. Let me close with one more story from my time in government. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of trying to help someone and finding that they have more to offer you than you can possibly give them. Several years ago now, I was in Kampala, Uganda, in a refugee community on the side of a steep hill. 90% of the residents were women or children, refugees from up north, where a brutal cultish rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army killed large numbers of the men. Many of the women were HIV positive and had terrible stories of suffering. Some of the boys had been kidnapped by the LRA and trained as soldiers, forced, I was told, to do terrible things, such as murdering family members and neighbors in their home village so they could never return. One of the former child soldiers I met was maybe 16 or 17 years old. When the leader of the LRA, Joseph Kony, visited his prisoners, all were forced to prostrate themselves. But this young man looked up in curiosity, and they took out one of his eyes in punishment. The center of the settlement is a steep-walled open-pit mine. Brush is pushed against the walls and set on fire to remove water from the rock and cause it to crumble, leaving a permanent haze in the air. The women of the village support themselves by getting rocks out of the pit and breaking them into gravel with small metal hammers. Each has her own pile she adds to for several hours a day. After Hurricane Katrina on the American Gulf Coast, these women, many of them HIV positive, somehow collected a few $100s and sent it to the American Embassy to help with relief efforts. When I thanked them on behalf of our government, I have never seen a group of people more proud of themselves. I was told by one woman, "We are the donors now." The generosity of the poor turns out to be more impressive than anything we give them. We should be honored to take their side and humble enough to learn from them. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Yeah, we've got some time for some questions, and I would just like to start with, you've raised some really interesting perspectives on both foreign aid and bipartisanship. And right now, obviously, we're stalled in a little bit of moving in either of those. Where do you see some bright pathways ahead, and how can we move forward from your perspective?
I think it's fair to say, and it's a large topic that I've written about some, that we live in a period of intense polarization in which the parties themselves are ideologically sorted. So you have one more liberal party and one more conservative party. And because of gerrymandering and a lot of other issues, there's smaller amount of middle ground in American politics. I think that's absolutely true. One reason that I enjoy being involved in this issue in particular is because it still does seem to be an exception. The reality is when we did the reauthorization of PEPFAR in 2008, in the middle of a presidential campaign, the two people that made sure it happened were President Bush and Senator Joe Biden, who was running for Vice President of the United States at the time and was head of the Foreign Relations Committee. You wouldn't have found that on too many other issues. So it's one of the attractive things about these issues. As I mentioned, we're now seeing a fraying of some of that at the edges of the Republican coalition in ways that I find quite disturbing. And also the fiscal pressures there. All that said about polarization, I will have to say that I think we're seeing the groundwork laid in the Republican defeat from 2003 for some progress on issues like immigration reform, which I'm not sure I would have expected in that aftermath. But I can assure you, it's a sobering thing to go. In 2004, we lost, in the Bush run, we lost the Hispanic vote by 9 points. Mitt Romney lost the Hispanic vote by 44 points, which is not consistent with having a national party in the future. And I think Republicans are getting that. I think parties often do the right thing when they've exhausted all the other alternatives. And we'll see, because the base of the party still has some significant concerns here. But if we were to have, we have a period of intense polarization, but I will say, if we were to have a grand budget bargain that involves significant revenues and structural changes in entitlement programs, and we were to have immigration reform, those would be legacies that any president of the United States would be proud of, and could build a library and talk about. And I think Barack Obama could do that on both of those issues if that comes to pass. And I think that there's at least a prospect that we're going to see that. But as I say, this is going to be a period of prolonged austerity, and sometimes those debates get particularly nasty and petty, because a lot of people are going to be taking hits in these future budgets. Anyone else?
Is there a dollar value that you should put on foreign aid as far as the return on investment?
It's hard to do. You can do it within individual programs because you can count the amount, with some precision, the amount of lives saved for the interventions you do. I mean, a program like PMI, the President's Malaria Initiative, is relatively new. I think it came into operation in 2006. It's a good example of some of the things that I've been talking about. The first leader of that program, Admiral Tim Ziemer, was in the Bush administration. He now is still in that role, was retained by President Obama to run this program. It's unbelievably efficiently and well run, and has probably saved the lives of 800,000 children under 5. And you can precisely calculate what kind of input you get for that. It's harder to measure national influence. As I mentioned, China has a huge role in Africa, and I see it everywhere I go. They have a very measurable outcome for that intervention, which is access to resources. And they pursue a very mercantile foreign policy. And so they build roads, and they build soccer stadiums, and they build capitol buildings, and they do major construction projects, and they ask for concessions. We don't really work that way. In some of our embassies in Africa, 70 to 80% of the US budget spent out of those embassies is for health spending because of these major programs. And it's just harder to measure how that relates to long-term American interest, although it's certainly gained a lot of goodwill. in the same way that I think people, when you're on in the continent, people talk about PEPFAR, which Americans don't even know what the acronym is, in the same way they talk about the Peace Corps, and it makes a difference. I mean, in the way that people view America. And so I think that you can make a good case that this is true. And as I said, it's not as though we are without competitors for influence in an increasingly strategic continent. And that's true on the resource side, it's true on ideological conflict, it's true in a lot of different areas. This has become one of our main ways that we influence this kind of strategic environment. And from what I can see on the ground, it's having a good effect.
Speak for a moment about the importance of Congress and our president to hear from people about supporting issues like this in the program?
I think it's fair to say that these type of issues have a very limited natural constituency. African leaders don't have too much access on Capitol Hill. People dying of AIDS in remote villages don't really count very much in the normal political process. It means that all of those people, in this case literally millions of people, depend on someone else to provide their voice in the councils of government. And that's why I think one plays an important role, and other advocacy groups and faith-based groups. If you look at that coalition for these type of programs and interventions in America, as I mentioned, it includes very religious people that are concerned about human rights and values and human dignity. It includes, traditionally more liberal human rights and development organizations. It includes a very strange, broad coalition, hopeful coalition of people that want America to be engaged in changing and saving and helping lives across the world. But it really requires people to have a voice, people to have an influence beyond their numbers. And every other interest in Washington has vocal and well-funded advocates. And this is one that doesn't have that kind of natural constituency. And so, one of my main concerns, I won't go too far into it, but one of my main concerns is that there's so much turnover in the Congress that many of the people who passed PEPFAR in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, in the House and Senate, have come since those debates and know almost nothing about what America is doing on these issues. So part of it is just informing people of goodwill about the accomplishments of our country, the bipartisan accomplishments of our country. And I think that can make a big difference. I like members of Congress. I know a lot of them. They're well-intentioned people. And I think that they need to hear from particular constituencies, which I think have disproportionate influence on Capitol Hill. I worked on Capitol Hill on and off for a decade. I think committed college students have a real influence in the way that when congressmen, I think they listen to that. They listen to youth and idealism. They listen to former military people who often are advocates on these issues, have seen the need for a kind of hopeful development agenda. They listen to religious leaders from their own districts when they intervene on these type of humanitarian issues, which I think is a very important constituency. I think they listen to women's rights and empowerment groups, because so much of this agenda has to do with the empowerment of women in societies where that's a real need. That I think is a very productive intervention on the part of advocates to call attention to those issues. And so, but it requires that type of broad coalition because to some extent it's a group of people with great needs and not much of a voice. Please. You? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your talk. I
I think that that's been one of the main focus in the, for example, in the reauthorization. The discussion was, well, how do you move beyond an emergency program? In the initial stages of the program, we were literally putting up tents and using community volunteers to distribute drugs, because all of a sudden there are the resources to put tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and then millions of people on treatment. And it was, it was an emergency situation just to save people from death. Okay? But of course that's a very different task than building local capacity to take over these purposes after you end the emergency stage here. They're not unrelated. I don't want to say they're separate, because these efforts, the kind of infrastructure and professionalism we put in place for these PEPFAR programs, the reporting requirements, the training that went on, that does actually convey to these countries. It builds capacity in these cases. And I think you can make a good case that PEPFAR was also building capacity all along, because it was working with local partners, indigenous groups, and expanding their capacities. But now we're clearly moving to a different stage, and we're reaching some landmarks. So this year, South Africa will announce formally, and there are a bunch of members of Congress going over there, that they are no longer going to receive help from PEPFAR to provide drugs. They're going to do it all themselves. Okay? And that's a great achievement. Much of Africa is not in that circumstance, unfortunately. But South Africa is going to make that transition and take charge of many of these programs and policies. And it's not going to be easy, from friends I have that are involved in that. But it's an essential transition. But all of it, by the way, is not unrelated to the final point I made, which is this is only going to be sustainable in the long run for countries in Africa if we can fairly dramatically reduce the rate of new infections. Okay? It's what experts call the treatment mortgage. Okay? Because once people go on treatment, they're on treatment the rest of their lives. And you entail a moral commitment then to continue to support this. And in order to reduce that treatment mortgage, over time, you have to get the rate of new infections down. And so I'm hopeful that with this new series of prevention technologies and techniques we have, that if we were to be able to spend some more money in the present, we could reduce the need in the future and make the problem itself more manageable in allowing countries themselves to take over these problems. So I think that's an essential step as well. But what you'd eventually like to see in many countries is to move from the PEPFAR model, where we often had to come in and do a lot of things, okay? Because there were gaps in the country's health systems themselves, to more the Global Fund model, where we can give money to the Global Fund and they can support governments that themselves are pursuing responsible policies and building capacity. Okay? You'd like to see that, more and more of that over time, so that eventually they can take over these roles.
Question about international partnerships. So when you see emergency responses to natural disasters, sometimes it's the U.S., sometimes it's a coalition of developing countries that might be responding. A lot of those are instantaneous; they have to happen within 24 hours or something. You described an interesting situation where you're sitting around the coffee table discussing how you're going to put together policy on AIDS. And the question is does the conversation, or did the conversation lead to the benefit or the value of partnering with others versus building it alone? And, there's a lot of issues there. There's something like this credit versus maybe having more countries involved, more resources, et cetera. So could you address that maybe a little bit?
On the PEPFAR side, and the AIDS response in particular, you had a good side and a bad side to this. Okay? The bad side was the need was so great, and there were very few other countries at that point who were willing to take an analogous role. Okay? That the U.S. scaled up so dramatically and massively that I know you did develop this notion where the Europeans and to some extent other donors around the world said, well, America does AIDS. We do other things. We're going to do this or we're going to do that. Okay? And that was not, I think that was an unintended side effect of an effort at that scale. Okay? And not a good thing in the long run. The flip side, the good side of that, is what we tried to do with the Global Fund. Okay? The Global Fund, by definition, America, I think the figure is that we provide 1/3 of the Global Fund, okay? And other countries have to provide the balance. And that's how, and they actually go out and do funding conferences where America makes a commitment, and then they raise from other developed countries to try to match, a 2/3 match, essentially, to provide the range of services provided by the Global Fund. There are other good examples. The Gavi Alliance on Vaccines is a truly multi-lateral organization and group. Because the Global Fund is one of the main ways that we do malaria as well, that's a good example as well. But even there, I'll be blunt, sometimes international organizations cannot be, to put this mildly, they can be bureaucratic, okay? They can sometimes not be as outcome-oriented. And we've seen that dynamic, by the way, with the Global Fund, where they went through a major scandal, a crisis, where a significant amount of money being diverted, and a major new series of financial controls and new leadership put into place at American insistence. And the new leader of the Global Fund, Mark Dybul, is actually really shaking up the organization, doing a fantastic job. But as I said, what I'd like to see eventually, I'm a big fan of PEPFAR. I still think we need bilateral approach here for many reasons. But the transition you eventually want to do is build enough local capacity so that you can use multilateral organizations like the Global Fund to become a funding stream for responsible governments. And it just varies whether we're there in some places and not there in other places. So when I look on the ground, there's actually a very complementary role between PEPFAR and the Global Fund in most countries that you go to. They play different roles. Where PEPFAR has a lot more emphasis on, we bring a lot of human capital to bear. I know people from CDC that sit in the office next to the health minister of Namibia and help them put together their countrywide plans. Okay, that's what PEPFAR does, and has people on the ground and does trying to build capacity and doing direct interventions to solve specific problems. And the Global Fund is more of a funding mechanism to empower countries. But I think that should be the direction. So. Yes, please.
Do you think America is in Africa right now more so for the minute, like for saving lives, but that's or for the economic benefits that they will receive possibly in the future?
I guess I was trying to argue that they're kind of complementary in this case. It's not a zero-sum game. It is a little bit of a zero-sum game if your goal is to exploit natural resources, okay? But I don't see too much of that in America's role in Africa, at least directly. It has been true in the past in certain industries, there's no question. But American health interventions certainly aren't designed in that way. But I think that a lot of businesses, business leaders, international business leaders that I have interactions with are suddenly realizing that most of the economic growth in the next 20 years is going to take place outside of America. we're probably going to bump along 2, 3, 4% growth. The developing world is going to have a dramatically higher growth percentages and will represent a tremendous growth opportunity to sell into those markets. That to me is the good thing about trade. It causes dislocations and it causes problems, and you have to protect people's rights. But it is a tremendous source of economic growth in the developing world, the main source of economic growth. If you look what matters most to lift millions of people out of poverty all at once, okay, it's trade, it's direct investment, international direct investment, and it's internal investment, market, so that people, when they start to generate wealth within their country, invest it internally in ways that are productive. So you want to, and a lot of that has to do with governance and that set of issues, which I think is a key in determining long-term economic growth. But from my perspective, and I'm kind of free market on these issues, for all the challenges and problems, if you're in Rwanda, if you're in Uganda, if you're in Tanzania, they want expanded trade with the world. That's their great comparative advantage and opportunity. So I think that American business in that way, under the right circumstances, can both do well and do good. Okay.
I've heard criticism that so much effort or attention focused on combating and preventing HIV/AIDS has almost overshadowed or marginalized other health initiatives on other diseases and problems. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think, I'm a big advocate of AIDS programs, and I know, having seen it, that it's easy to second guess now because a lot of these countries were really teetering on the edge of social collapse at one point, not too long ago, 10 years ago. AIDS is sometimes viewed as a disease of the poor, but it really was not the case in many African countries. It was taking, a whole class of nurses, doctors, teachers, civil servants, people that were making society work. Okay? Zambia is a case, for example, where at one point in the crisis, they had, for every new teacher that was trained in Zambia, 2 were dying. Okay? That's not brain drain, which is what you normally talk about in Africa. It was death drain for a significant portion of their professional class. And so I think that it was fully justified for the world to respond in that way. But it did. It's a disproportionate intervention. Okay? And the reauthorization of PEPFAR, I think, the law, as it was reauthorized, began to recognize that. That eventually you can't just do AIDS, you have to do health systems, essentially. And when you do health systems, it benefits a lot of other people in that. And so a significant portion of PEPFAR funding was released or opened or repurposed more broadly on health issues in the PEPFAR reauthorization. Okay? That was a natural evolution. I think that some people, thought there might have been problems there, but I think it's, generally been moving in the right direction. And the Obama administration has attempted to move in that direction with its, it has a global health, integrated global health approach where it tries to draw resources from a variety of areas to do system building and other things. They've had a real emphasis on that, and I think it's an appropriate one. So I guess my general answer to that is, having seen what was going on at the time, an emergency response at that scale was essential. But it's a natural evolution of the program to be more oriented towards the building of health structures that are going to benefit efforts much more broadly. Thank you.